Get going. Well, welcome everybody to another session of the Mountain Sky Conference Vital Conversations. It is good to have all of you here with us and have those that will be joining over the next few minutes. I'm a different face hosting this since the last time you gathered, but it is my joy to be here. I'm Jeff Rainwater, currently Wyoming District Superintendent for the next 6 days, but the incoming Congregational and Community Vitality Superintendent for our conference. Michael has moved on to what, at least visually, may truly be greener pastures, headed back to the much wetter New Jersey, but we wish him well and we thank him for his year with us and look forward to remaining connected with him. I want to make some introductions today. First, we are just overjoyed to welcome the Reverend Dr. Tom Bandy of Ministry Matters and others to be our guest presenter for Vital Conversations. Tom is an internationally recognized author, consultant, and leadership coach for Christian organizations and faith-based nonprofits across the country and probably around the world. He mentors and coaches diverse church and nonprofit leaders for personal growth, program development, and organizational sustainability. He is widely published, brings a wealth of information that can benefit organizations of all sizes, denominations, and locales. Today, he's speaking to us about community trends and ministry transformations in the midst of two pandemics, COVID-19 and racism. His most recent book is Sideline Church, Bridging the Chasms Between Churches and Cultures by Abington Press, which addresses much of what we will discuss today. So welcome, Tom. We are glad to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be with you.
I also want to welcome the Reverend Dr. Tom Barlow, who helped set this up. He is, for today at least, the Director of Alumni and Community Education and an adjunct faculty for Methodist and Leadership Studies with the Iliff School of Theology. But starting to July 1st, he will be the senior pastor of Littleton United Methodist Church. And he's going to share with us a little bit about Iliff Resource because Tom Bandy is brought to us by the generosity of Iliff Resource. So Tom Barlow, take it away.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I just wanted to take a quick moment and acknowledge the reality of funding that makes this kind of thing possible. We have funding from the Lilly Endowment through the Resource at Iliff program. You can read more about what Resource offers at resource.iliff.edu. There is a little bit of quiet time up on the Resource site right now because I'm transitioning out, but I have been told that Resource will continue at Iliff and they are developing new programs. So stay tuned. There's a lot more to come. Jeff, back to you.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to turn it over to our guest presenter to share with us now. Welcome again, everyone. Welcome, Tom Bandy. We're glad you're with us. Please lead us in a conversation today.
Well, again, thank you, Jeff, and thanks, Tom, and thanks to the conference for inviting me to be with you today. This webinar is intended as a discussion starter, and we're going to skim over a lot of things, and we can only investigate more deeply a few things. My assumption, however, is that this is a discussion starter and that there will be other opportunities for discussion, panels, gatherings, small groups, and so on, that hopefully will include a greater diversity of culture and race within the conference, so that a lot of different people can share their different points of view on a subject which is very speculative, and that's the future of the church post-COVID-19. This webinar will be in two parts, basically, and there will be an opportunity to ask questions after each part. First part is really about the community. It's about culture and how American culture is being reshaped, both by COVID-19 and pandemic, and also by racism and the new surge, lasting surge in anxiety and concern around issues of racism in America. The second part, a little more practical, is about the church and how it will likely or may change significantly in the future to be more relevant to the culture that is emerging. No one knows for sure all that is going to happen, but I think as I listen to conversations around the country, cross-denominationally, cross-organizationally, cross-culturally, there are certain things that I think are beginning to appear, and that's what we're going to be talking about. You've heard a lot of people talk about the new normal and how things are never going to be the same. This is what I think people mean by that. When they say new normal, what they're anticipating is that there will be such radical community change that every sector in America will operate differently. Public education will be done differently. Corporate business and retail business will be done differently. Social services will be focused differently. Recreation, entertainment habits will be done differently. Everything in every sector is going to be radically and permanently changed. Also, the new normal affects the church, and by that I mean how we do Sunday school will never be the same. How we deploy and train leaders will not be the same. Certainly our outreach ministries will have different foci. Our worship services, our hospitality methods are going to change. But when people talk about the new normal, what I really would like to get people to be aware of is that it's deeper than that. It's about attitude shifting and radically changing lifestyle habits. Every conversation I have with clergy right now, I always ask, how are you? And 100% of the time, they always say, first thing, I'm tired, I'm fatigued. And yeah, a lot of the fatigue is trying to understand what's happening in the world, trying to learn new technologies and techniques in terms of our ministries. But what's really fatiguing clergy, and I think many in the public, is that deep down inside, we're having to really radically shift our attitudes toward life and our unconscious daily patterns and habitual behaviors that we have assumed pretty much all our lives to this point. People also talk about the two pandemics, and I want to just share in a nutshell my perspective on the relationship of these two pandemics that overlap. And in a nutshell, I would say this: racism leads to poverty, xenophobia, and depression. And COVID-19 feeds off poverty, selfishness, and vulnerability. And it's like two pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that fit perfectly together. So racism leads to things and COVID feeds those things. We've seen that in many occasions. There have been other kinds of epidemics. They have affected the people who are poor and vulnerable and so on. A couple of weeks ago, I heard a terrific sermon from Dr. William Barber II. He was preaching at Washington National Cathedral. And what he observed is that the common thread in these two epidemics is the term, quote unquote, acceptable death. And in racism, we came to a place after the 60s, after those initial policy changes, where society seemingly unconsciously came to a place where there was an acceptable death rate among African-American people and among other vulnerable populations and minorities. So that was acceptable. We would live with it because other people could then enjoy their lives. Same with, we see it with the pandemic. We're tempted to have an acceptable level of death. It's okay if certain elderly people, vulnerable people, and other people die. We'll accept that risk so that other people can live on. And I think what Dr. Barber said in his sermon very powerfully is accepting death is not an option anymore. And I think that really is part of the new normal. And we'll see that played out in the church and culture and so on. But when you get to the bottom line, this tacit social acceptance or toleration, you might say, of death is being challenged now. And in the new normal, that's going to be radically different. So we'll get started if we can and begin to look, first of all, at community trends. I'd like to share my screen here, if I can. You don't need to look at my Zoom screen. So, so we're talking about community trends and ministries, transformations, and you can see, moving some things aside, I want to talk about 4 cultural trends, first of all. I want to dwell on the first one most. On the positive side, what we are seeing are 4 important trends. A new neighborliness, a recovery of lost relationships, a narrowing of generation gaps, and a very interesting merging of for-profit efficiency with nonprofit integrity. And then there are also some negative trends we're also observing, and I'll comment as we go along. Let me say something first about the new neighborliness, because it builds on the conversation about racism and building biracial churches and cross-cultural relationships. I want to speak specifically about one lifestyle segment. There are about 20 lifestyle segments in America out of 71 that include high proportions of African Americans, and they range across the board in different lifestyles and incomes and so on. And this is one of them. As you know, I work with missioninsight.com and have created a lot of resources for them. And when I focus on suburban attainment, I do so because you see these folks in so many of our urban centers, both large and middle-sized cities. And this is kind of what they look like and kind of who they are. And it is possible to build relationships between races by building on bridges between lifestyle segments. This is a thematic map of Denver, and we can see here the code numbers. This is D18, the code number for suburban attainment, an African American, more upwardly mobile, emerging middle class lifestyle segment. And when you look at that and look at the different lifestyle segments that live around them, sorry about that, I need to go backwards. We can do what I call influence mapping, because we know that if we did a people plot of any given congregation and we located our member households in this map, we have some member households in lifestyle segments that live proximately or share compatibilities with the D18 lifestyle segment. And it is through those people who are members of our households that the church begins to build a greater empathy, biracial empathy with other people. So we know in doing an influence map that, for example, we see these O51 people here. They're called digital dependents. We see O54 people over here. Those people are called striving single scene. And notice right here, a pocket of E19, full pockets, empty nesters through here, all living very in close approximation to suburban attainment. And all those lifestyle segments are having interactions with these people. And in the new neighborliness that we're seeing emerging, that means that although we're social distancing from our normal in-group, we are leaning over the fence, we are checking in on the neighbors, we are having time to look at our neighbors eye to eye and face to face, and we're learning more about them as we go. And so these boundaries become very fluid, and lifestyle segments can, in a sense, lean over the fence, begin to talk with other lifestyle segments. And we can build biracial churches and more biracial empathy when these lifestyle segments lead the way in the church. Now, unfortunately, many lifestyle or other lifestyle segments that do not have that automatic compatibility with D18. You'll notice over here, for example, A05, these are called couples with clout. This Route 35 is obviously a boundary between them. They probably rarely cross the street to talk to each other, but many of these people are in our church and they would like to have a conversation, but somehow they're not able to do it. So they will work through and talk through the E19 and the O54 and other lifestyle segments to build that bridge of empathy. I just wanted to share that with you because that's another map of Charlotte, because we can use Mission Insight to build and take advantage of this new neighborliness that we're seeing emerge. There are other positive cultural trends, and each of them are offset by some negative reactions. So in the last weeks, offsetting the new neighborliness that had been emerging in March and April and May, we have begun to see negatively radical individualism and the decline of social responsibility. And particularly, we're seeing this in the church. I've talked to a lot of clergy who are having parishioners, some parishioners being extremely angry with them, even denigrating them in terms of closing their worship services. I see a few people nodding. Maybe you've had this experience yourself. And we know that as we reopen churches, there will be intentional noncompliance. And many churches are going to challenge with accountability processes. And there's going to be some stress around that. And so this radical individualism and decline of social responsibility, it's based in entitlement. It's surrounds our kind of comfortable homogeneity. And that is a negative cultural trend. Second trend, and I'll pass over some of these a little faster. Obviously, we're seeing an emergence of racial tensions. Even before the protests and riots began several weeks ago, this was anticipated as part of the post-COVID future, because we know that medical care and medical support among African Americans is much less, very, very contrasting with that available to Euro Americans. But what I would like to add to that is that these racial tensions in the new normal have gone beyond the old normal, which was the post-60s days of civil rights. In the post-60 days of civil rights, racial tension was addressed through policy change and strategic planning on the whole. But in the new normal, it is the unrehearsed word and the spontaneous deed that will reveal the truth about our attitudes. And in the new normal, the expectation will not be so much on just policy changes or strategic planning, but on individual people, individual church people, radically altering the day-to-day attitudes and behavior patterns that they don't even think about in daily life. And it is really that building of relationships, of personal relationships, and of friendships that is going to be the great challenge, but also the great hope, I think, in the new normal. Because we have to go beyond just making policy changes and doing some different strategic plans and altering our curriculums and programs to go deeper and build empathic relationships. A second trend, our third trend culturally, is the politicization of cultural diversity. We are beyond controversy over illegal immigration, and we are now into controversy over any immigration. And we're fighting cultural generalizations. And that stress level is also increasing in society. We can anticipate unemployment and economic recession. And part of that for the church and for culture is the growing class consciousness and the gap between those who are able to survive social distancing because they have investment security and those who do not. We're going to see a lot more housing insecurity, a lot more concern for personal safety, And these issues culturally will probably dominate church outreach, thinking, and strategizing. And then lastly, just to pass by it, yet another significant fact is mental and relational health issues are going to grow substantially. We are already seeing upticks in domestic violence and in child abuse and suicide and depression. And so the frontline workers that we think about first today in the COVID-19 wards and the emergency wards, there's going to be frontline workers in the future. And those are going to be the mental health and relational healthcare workers that are going to have to deal with this overflow of anxiety. Moving on then to some religious trends that are happening in culture today. I'll just name three. We're seeing a rise in personal religion and personal spirituality. The fastest growing religious movement, if you could call it that, in America is personal religion. And that is accelerating during post-COVID-19 and afterwards. Along with that, personal religion can range from the strangest kinds of superstitions and magical ideas and science fiction to much more elaborate syncretistic blends of different world religions and their methodologies. Personal religion is going to grow, and as personal religion grows, then we're seeing a significant decline in orthodoxies, whether it's Protestant tradition, Anglican tradition, Catholic tradition. Just a brief example, I was traveling just before COVID-19 happened, and I was in South Carolina, stopped for lunch at a diner with a friend, and we were talking about social issues and the future of the church and so on, and engaged the server in conversation. She happened to be the manager of the restaurant. And very excited, she was telling us her story and her struggle and how much she's learned and what her career pattern and what her hopes were. And at various points along the way, she would cross herself. Where did that come from? This is an African-American waitress, and she was brought up, she said, in a Baptist tradition, and she's incorporated genuflection into her personal behavior patterns. And we begin to see how there's a borrowing in personal religion from all kinds of different traditions. And so there is a decline, an accelerated decline in denominationalism, and you might say in orthodoxies. We are going to see real tests of faith in terms of challenges to our moral imperative. In a world of personal religion, there is more judgment between persons, more anxiety that will be judged by other persons, and a greater tendency to evaluate other persons according to a particular ideological or dogmatic belief system, and ignoring the greater complexity of themselves as persons in the life that they're living. I think one of the things we're seeing very much in the Methodist Church, as well as other denominations, is a kind of monomania that's also challenging the moral imperative. And by this, I mean a fixation on a particular issue, a particular source, a particular ideology, and other tests of faith that are dividing people and dividing denominations. Again, people being pigeonholed as being this ideological holder versus that ideological advocate, and they're not seen as whole persons. The truth is that when we look now at protest marches, if we take a good look, they're much more heteronymous, much more cross-cultural than they ever were in the 60s. And if we take a close look at who's walking with whom, who's marching with whom, we will see black and white marching together. We'll see D18 suburban attainment people marching with G25s driving single scene people, or E19 empty nester people. And if we ask them, these people might well disagree about other issues, whether it's sexual orientation or whether it's global warming or whatever it might be. But we have overcome that monomania to be united in this cause. And I think that the challenge in the future is that monomania is going to continue to divide denominations and keep them from really understanding the bigger picture of what unites us. And since I'm talking to Methodists, I'll just throw in the comment. One of the great post-COVID-19 challenges for the United Methodist Church is that the Wesleyan Quadrilateral is at risk, at serious risk. Because in the monomania of people, they're looking at just one part of the Wesleyan Quadrilateral to discern truth. Some look at the Bible, some look at history and tradition, some look at the current movement of the Holy Spirit, some look at their own human reason and science. But in the Wesleyan Quadrilateral, of course, all four of those inform our understanding of truth. But that is at risk in terms of the debates that are happening within the United Methodist Church. And they're also at risk, you might say, in other denominations and traditions as well. So just in passing, I'll note that the last religious trend I'm thinking about is or the demise of organized religion, the continuing shrinking of organized religion. Why? Because it is seen as a nexus of distrust. When we do demographic studies and lifestyle studies with Mission Insight, and we ask people to name the #1 reasons for non-participation in the church, or we ask church members to identify the #1 reasons that they're thinking of leaving the church, what do you think the top 3 reasons are for non-participation in the church? #1, we don't trust the leadership. #2, they're all too judgmental. And #3, all they think about is money. And with that spirit rising and increasing and accelerating in the post-COVID-19 world, we're going to see organized religion challenge more and more for its latent hypocrisy and the contradiction between its pure ideals and its impure living among its people. So those are some religious trends. And then just to name some church trends, and then I'm going to pause for any questions you might have. And you can feel free to take me off on some different tangents. But there are some important church trends that we need to note. The first one, maybe I'm going to switch to share my screen. You're probably tired of looking at my face, and give you something else to look at. Come back to that in a moment. The first church trend that I see, and we've already been seeing it before COVID-19, but it's dramatically accelerating, and I describe it as the decline of the church growth movement and the rise of the church depth movement. And what I mean by this is in the last 20 or 30 years, the church growth movement has dominated our agenda. And we've all been talking over and over again, we're talking about multiplying disciples, multiplying leaders, multiplying readers, attracting more people to worship, increasing our attendance, having more impactful preaching, increasing our income and generosity. All these aspects of the church growth movement are dying and being replaced by what I think is the church depth movement, where bigger is no longer better, but smaller is much deeper. And instead of increasing by size and geography, we are focusing on depth in small group and leadership. And we tend to be digging down into the neighborhoods where we are already present, rather than trying to enter new neighborhoods where we might draw people into our church membership. The church growth movement is a shift from homogeneity to heterogeneity, from a franchise model of denomination where all United Methodist churches look the same, to a more customized model in which every United Methodist church may actually feel and be very, very different from each other, even though united around certain principles. The church depth movement is more about mentoring than discipling. And I see the pattern more and more for clergy, and it's a challenge for many clergy. The clergy who are caregivers, enablers, and CEOs are going to struggle more and more and more in the post-COVID-19 world. The clergy who are able to be true disciplers and visionaries and mentors will begin to grow and expand their ministries in the post-COVID-19 world. Because more is being done one-on-one and mentoring a small group of people to go deeper and deeper and deeper into their closeness with Christ, rather than trying to multiply disciples who are saying the right dogmatic things and contributing the right amounts of money and attending worship in the right amounts of time and neglecting their, you might say, their personal life disciplines and their spiritual growth. So we're drilling deeper instead of growing bigger. Second church trend, I think, and this is accelerating and it can be difficult for many churches. It's the end of bureaucracy and bricks and the emergence of a great search for credible leadership and accountability. You can think of that as a shift from merely friendly churches with low accountability because they prize friendliness so much, to high accountability churches that hold people to higher standards of behavior patterns and faith disciplines. In other words, in the post-COVID-19 world, the church will be a byproduct of spiritual discipline. Whereas in the pre-COVID church, spiritual discipline was a byproduct of the church, if you follow me. So and the way we used to do it is, well, let's bring people into the church. And then we'll try to enlist them into small groups, into Sunday school, and so on. And the truth is that over time, in most churches, evangelical and mainstream, less than 3 to 4% of the membership, adult membership, are actually engaged in any serious spiritual discipline on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. That's turning around. And in the post-COVID-19 church, first, we're going to be practicing accountable spiritual disciplines together, and that may or may not result in a sustainable church of bricks and mortars, and it will become just the reverse. Parallel to this is the demise of the family church and the rise of what I would call the Pilgrim Band. And by this, I mean that all those small friendly churches, and 80% of the churches in America are less than 100 people, and they pride themselves, they call themselves church families. They value the friendliness and multi-generational quality of their congregations. But those churches in the post-COVID-19 world will become increasingly unsustainable. And instead, already through the Fresh Expressions movement and in other ways, we're seeing the emergence of smaller, highly disciplined, mutually accountable, spiritual groups of people like pilgrims who are simultaneously deepening their spiritual lives and serving the community, so that the merging of outreach and spiritual growth in the future is replacing the collaboration of worship attendance and spiritual growth in the past. Worship is becoming less and less important for many people. And the entry point into spiritual life and to meet Jesus Christ in a transformative way is through the Pilgrim Band and the outreach ministry. Last thing I'll mention, which I don't seem to have on this slide, is again, difficult. The post-COVID-19 world is unfortunately seeing clergy become more and more irrelevant. Ordination becoming more and more irrelevant. Certification more and more irrelevant. And instead, people are looking for credible spiritual leaders and entrepreneurs that may or may not be certified and trained and ordained. When we look at Mission Insight research, the millennials, many of the Gen Xers, the Gen Y, the Gen Z, these emerging generations, when they are looking for leaders or spiritual leaders, they're looking for what I call heroes of faith. They don't necessarily listen to a sermon, and they don't want to talk to a preacher or go to a Sunday school class, but they will dedicate enormous amounts of time in the coffee shop having coffee with someone that looks and sounds like Nelson Mandela, or someone like Dr. Barber, who was preaching just a couple of weeks ago, to spend a few moments with a hero of faith, someone who has been there, done that, staked their life on God and the future, and can spend time talking and mentoring me. That's the kind of leader these emerging generations are looking for. So many of the skills that clergy like me were trained in, and my seminary was Princeton, but many of our skills, preaching skills, teaching skills, writing skills, facilitating skills, administrative skills, all those skills we learned are less and less important. And what we need to learn are community research skills, listening skills, mentoring skills, spiritual disciplines, and practical skills, because that more and more is what emerging generations are looking for, and that's what they see as credible spiritual leadership in the future. So I want to pause and turn to Jeff and Dawn, perhaps. I know that I've covered a lot, probably said a number of things that are surprising, some confirming, maybe raised eyebrows, and I'm open to whatever questions or thoughts you'd like to share. I mean, I'll try to respond.
So friends, and sorry for the printer if you hear it in the background, but what questions do you have? And if you'd like, you can type them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and share them out loud.
Hi, Tom. My name is Davida from the Tongan United Methodist Church, Salt Lake City.
Yes.
I see all the decline that you mentioned over here, and I'm very impressed for the ideas. But I want to know, is that similar or maybe the same with a church more cultural? Like we are majority, they are Tongan. Is that working for the culture too, or they are different dynamic?
I'd see two things, at least two things happening. Is it David? That's what's on the screen.
Yeah.
I see two things happening. One is that homogeneous churches in general that are of any culture, Black, white, Hispanic, Latino, Native Indian, Asian, Southeast Asian, or whatever. That's in the past how churches had generally grown and survived in homogeneity. And we brought in people essentially that spoke the same language, looked like us, maybe had the same income level or whatever. But what seemed the movement of the future is clearly around more heterogeneous congregations. And the challenge really isn't just for white churches to become more biracial and cross-cultural. It's also a challenge for any homogeneous church in the same way. Partly that's simply to be financially sustainable. But more importantly, that's really about being relevant to the multicultural diversity that is the reality of today. I spoke with 71 lifestyle segments in America today. 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when I first began to get into demographic lifestyle research, there were 40. So in 10 years, it's increased by like 30, 40%. And Experian is going to come out with new definitions in another year or two, and it's probably going to multiply even further. The old demographic stereotypes we used to use, Black, white, Hispanic, Latino, and so on, are becoming more and more irrelevant because the diversity of lifestyle segments within any of those different categories is multiplying and multiplying. And part of that's simply generational, first, second generation, third generation, and so on. So the first answer to your question is, I think there's a real hope in the future in terms of spiritual leadership among people of color, among immigrant communities in America, and among some emerging generations. But I also think long-term, the hope of the Christian movement as a whole lies in the ability to expand that into multicultural diversity. Second quick comment, David, I wanted to make, and there'll be other questions. Another thing I am observing, I mentioned the demise of bricks and mortar, bricks and bureaucracy churches. And so another trend I'm just beginning to see, which is a great trend, is declining white congregations, even in tall steeple churches, formerly prestigious in downtown areas, with large bricks, with a lot of bricks and buildings, are now signing over authority and responsibility and ownership of buildings to the immigrant communities and ethnic congregations that are actually were once renting from them and are now growing and thriving and drawing people from all different cultures. And the great movement is to let go that control, to let go that asset, so to speak, and to allow a whole new population to fully take over responsibility and authority, to change it in any way, to modify it in any way, to re-symbolize it in any way, without any conflict or committees, in order to be relevant to their particular cultural experience and reality and so on. So in small churches, the rule of thumb, I may come back to this a little bit, the rule of thumb for small churches, family churches in the future, post-COVID-19, is that we're going to see more and more and more and more of them close, unsustainable. And so here's the challenge: merge or perish. Merge or perish. Merge, you can combine resources that are going to help both your online and on-site worship, share leadership, and so many good things. But we have to overcome our tribalism, and we have to merge in order to sustain our congregations. Now, we've not had a good track record in the Methodist Church in mergers. However, there is, and are emerging new, very healthy ways in mission-driven mergers. And by the way, I've written a book on that. Other questions?
Thank you, Tom.
So we have some from the chat. One, Sarah Merchant wanted to hear, at the end you spoke about skills we need. Could you touch on that just briefly as leaders, spiritual leaders?
Yes, and maybe if you are following the handout I shared, I might venture into some of the practical changes that we're discovering around leaders. We already know that leaders, and I'm thinking at the moment of clergy leaders or professional leaders. We already know and are experiencing the need to upgrade our technological skills and to learn new languages in the multicultural world. We're learning how to do pastoral care in whole new ways. We're learning new educational methodologies and so on that are more experiential, more online. we're having to learn a lot of things. Those are all kind of skill sets. But I think some of the biggest things we're learning, some of the biggest shifts, for example, we're learning, is that our old professional habits will not be the same anymore. For example, clergy in the old world, in the pre-COVID world, clergy often spent hours researching and writing and maybe practicing a sermon that they would deliver in person, on site, in worship. But in the post-COVID world, and I may want to come back to this again, in the post-COVID world, it's not just that internet, digital worship, or virtual worship is going to stay. It's going to take over. Virtual worship will be the new norm of worship. In the old world, we did on-site worship, and maybe we would live stream it. But virtual worship was sort of the secondary thing. It's the extra we would do. And so clergy prepared their sermons and delivered their sermons in the same way as they always have done it. But now it's going to be reversed. Virtual worship will be the #1 kind of worship. And oh, by the way, we'll also have on-site worship sometimes for some people. And that means the way we develop and deliver a message in virtual worship is dramatically going to change. It'll be more dialogical. It'll be more interactive. It'll be more Q&A. It'll be interspaced with more music. There'll be more art. There'll be more drama. The spoken word will become less and less important. And that's going to be a real blow to a lot of clergy egos, but a great opportunity to those clergy who want to be mentors and visionaries, because they have a better platform, you might say, to speak cross-culturally and to take people deeper in their walk with Christ. So that's an example of some of the skills that are changing. I hope that starts to answer the question. I would like to say more about what happens to volunteerism and hospitality, and in particular, what happens to outreach in a few moments. But perhaps there's time for another question, Jeff?
Yeah, we'll do one more, and then I may see if I can be in touch with you about any others we have. One of the slides mentioned frustration of millennials. Can you say more about that, describe that?
Yes. The frustration, well, let me back up and say the good news is that cross-generationally, millennials and seniors have actually started to come together. In social distancing, for example, millennials have been visiting their grandparents and elders to coach them through the internet and to spend time with them. And there's been a great compassion and a renewed bond among, you might say, our settled and sensible J35 seniors and our millennials. But negatively, there's a growing gap between millennials and baby boomers, because the baby boomers are the ones who are holding on to all the jobs so that the millennials can't be upwardly mobile. It's the boomers that are making all the policy decisions in the church about program preferences and so on, and the millennials that are left out of leadership. So that's true in the church, and it's true more broadly in culture. The millennials are really among the vulnerable ones. And what's emerging is a new class consciousness, I think, in America. And part of that is age-based, older, boomer, senior, millennial, Gen Xer, and so on. But it's rooted in lack of economic mobility, housing disparities, not having securities for investments in retirement. There's so many privileges and benefits that one class has that another class is being denied. And in the post-COVID-19 world, that is becoming ever more marked. And yeah, we think about racism and the divide, black and white, but there's a huge divide continuing to grow, and millennials are getting more and more frustrated with all of the organizational institutional structures. But the root cause of that is that they really are not given space an opportunity to grow and to become like their parents had the opportunity to grow and become. And that's the gap I really wanted to talk about around millennials.
Thank you. Just to let you know, we tend to hold this to an hour, but we also go over, so probably about 25 more minutes to be together. It's a deep conversation. It could fill a day, I know. So, but just to give you a sense of the time.
Well, Jeff, can I say a little bit about more practical and specifically church transitions? And again, hopefully have a few minutes for questions.
Please do.
We talked a bit about leadership, and I just want to mention around, the post-COVID-19 leadership challenges. I mean, first of all, there's job losses. There are fewer and fewer sustainable churches. There are more and more clergy, and there are more and more clergy who are going to be looking for work. And by the way, that's going to increase some of the generational stress, because in our system, the seniority tends to count. The people that get work may be the older and rather than the younger. But that means in all, more and more bivocational ministry. So if I had something to say to seminary students or to younger clergy out there, and I've coached, I'm in coaching client relationships with a lot of different people, and over again, I'm having to say to them, bivocational. You've got to think bivocational, because the church is not going to give you a full-time salary. And in some ways, you look at it even more broadly, trying to help a little church survive is going to block you from your own calling to follow Jesus Christ. So bivocational ministry not only gives you financial sustainability, but in many ways it opens up new opportunities to follow your calling. But a lot of clergy are now searching themselves, trying to think, what am I skilled at? What am I trained at? What gift do I have, or what could I learn to begin to earn my living in some other way as I shape my entire lifestyle around connecting people with Christ and growing people in Christ? Big change. We're seeing already experiments way beyond Zoom with new internet platforms that are far more helpful for international and cross-cultural studies. And so seminaries are really going to be challenged to become increasingly virtual. We do a lot of online education already, but we're just like I said with churches and with on-site worship versus virtual worship, virtual education is going to be the go-to. That's becoming the #1 way. And we're going to develop new internet platforms to do it better. Now, there still will be opportunities probably to be together in a space on site with a teacher. And some of that's just where educational methodology would work better for certain things. But that does suggest that there's going to be a lot of seminaries with empty rooms and empty dormitories. Also, I'll notice that with the emergence and the search for credible spiritual leadership, alongside seminary training is re-emerging apostolic mentoring. And more spiritual leaders, particularly our lay pastors and our lay spiritual leaders, are likely to be less dependent on, again, seminary accreditations. And what they're going to do more and more is that they're going to connect with a faith tutor. They're going to connect with a person of spiritual depth and experience that can mentor them on an ongoing basis as they develop their ministry and grow in Christ. So it's much more personal. It's much more apostolic. And that's around leadership. A word about volunteerism. Already we're seeing that people are not going to volunteer out of a sense of duty to the institutional church anymore. They volunteer if it will bring them if it'll contribute to a holistic, healthy lifestyle. They will volunteer if in the midst of that, they have mentoring opportunities with a spiritual leader. They will volunteer if they see actual, practical, measurable outcomes in social change. But they're not just going to volunteer because we need somebody on the committee or I feel guilty if I don't, or whatever. But here's the biggest change, I think, in volunteerism. People are volunteering and will volunteer more and more today because they have a personal stake in something, not because they hold a particular ideological or justice position about something. And therefore, when they volunteer, they're staking, they're not just giving time, they're not just giving money, they're staking their life on this outreach. They're staking their life. And that's going to be the big change, aside from just health and opportunities and so on, in terms of volunteerism within the church. Keep going, Tom. Say a word about other aspects of church and change. Sorry, I've got to get my notes out again. I mentioned about worship and hospitality. I've already talked about internet worship, virtual worship becoming primary. I've mentioned that there's going to be new platforms, internet platforms for interaction. I should add that virtual worship is going to become challenged in the same way as online talk shows, as television talk shows. And that's, how do we hold an audience? How do we hold an audience? Churches are tracking participation in their virtual worship often. Some softwares allow them to do that. And they'll boast and they'll say, oh, we had 150 people visit our, well, yeah, they surfed by and they spent 2 minutes and they moved on. How do you hold their attention? And it's the same challenge they all have. And you hold attention by being interactive, by putting in various different medias, and interfacing music and drama and even comedy and whatever. And you might say to yourself, oh dear, worship is going to become more like entertainment. And actually, what's happening in our world today is that entertainment is becoming more like worship. And we're just recognizing the reality. So there are a number of changes in worship. I could also mention the delegation of traditional clergy roles and shared among different leaders. The main thing around worship I would note is the future is going to have enormous urgency and experimentation around worship. There is no best practice. There is no one way. It's going to be very local and global. And there's a lot of experimentation, but this is the word I'd like you to remember. It has to be urgent experimentation. We can't just dither around with it. We can't have a committee spend 20 years thinking about it. We can't test it with any number of focus groups. It's going to be experiment, fail, learn from your mistakes, do something crazy, look embarrassed, learn from your mistakes, but there's an urgency around our experimentation. Say a bit more about outreach. Here are the three big changes. I'll say it this way. Three big changes in the post-COVID-19 church. Number one, outreach is going to move away from education into immersion. So much of our pre-COVID-19 outreach has been about study groups, and it's been about a curriculum, and it's been about, well, let's read up on racism. And let's have an education, a small group, a training session, whatever. More and more, it's going to be about immersion. Don't go to a study group. Spend your vacation and go to the lifestyle segment that makes you the least comfortable, and spend 4 weeks with them and eat what they eat and learn what they learn and talk what they talk and dress as they dress, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's only by immersion that you create empathy. Education never creates empathy. It only creates knowledge. And in outreach today, we're moving from education to empathy, to immersion. Second big trend is we're moving from representation to intervention. Representation to intervention. Pre-COVID-19, a lot of our outreach was representative. We have a committee and they represent the congregation at the homeless center. And it's only about a dozen people who rotate and participate with it. But as a congregation, we say, oh, we're all involved in outreach because we have the committee. That's not working anymore. It's not credible to even homeless people. It's not viable. It's sustainable in the church. So we're moving from representation, and now we're talking about intervention. And it goes back to that personal stake in volunteerism. That with the upticks in family violence and child abuse and depression and suicide, and with the potential for spontaneous brutality on the streets and for discrimination just happening on any street corner racially. And in that world, what outreach is going to be is equipping every member of the church to have the chutzpah and the courage to intervene, to step in, to spread their arms and say no. And so you see, there's a risk in that. And there's going to be a much greater risk taking in our outreach if we're going to be successful in outreach in the post-COVID-19 world. The third big shift in outreach is we're going to move from what I call heated debate to empathic reconciliation. I know that we're passionate for justice. I also know that there's tremendous division and polarization around any number of ideological issues. We see it in our own denomination, the United Methodist Church. But in the post-COVID-19 world, what I see happening is people growing more and more impatient with church advocacy and more desperate for reconciliation ministries. What I see is a need to build bridges rather than confront people, to build conversation. And so what I'm seeing is when churches make ideological pronouncements, for example, people listen less and less and less. Because that's being said by a lot of places, often with greater expertise than we can bring to it. But what we can bring to the world that other groups cannot is reconciliation ministries, building bridges. And my sense is that that role in the church is going to become more dominant in our outreach than simply ideological pronouncements or standing up and advocating particular public policy this way or that way. Outreach. Education in small groups, we see it already. Post-COVID-19, we may well be seeing the end of the Sunday school, period. Replaced by homeschooling and home Christian education, virtually accomplished. We're seeing the end, I think, of small groups where people are going to gather together in a pandemic world simply to have coffee and have fellowship. That's not going to motivate people to stake their health and join the meeting. It'll be about self-improvement. So small groups are not going to be around, meeting my friends and having coffee and a good time. It's going to be more and more about how do I improve myself? How do I grow as a person, physically, relationally, mentally, spiritually, or whatever. But it's more and more about self-improvement. I think in the post-COVID-19 world, with the rise of personal religion, there's going to be really very little interest in confirmation classes, membership training classes, and learning doctrines and doctrinal certainty. Doctrinal certainty, including biblical certainty, is becoming less and less important. Instead, what draws people into education is to learn how to live faithfully. This is very practical. How do I live faithfully at work? How do I live faithfully with my family? How do I live faithfully in my marriage? And that kind of faithful living agenda is now more important than any dogmatic or ideological agenda. A last word about administration, property, and finance, and then questions. I'll just say it and not really explain it. What's the future? Smaller boards, spending less time in higher trust. Sacred mobility will become more valuable than sacred property. As virtual space takes over, a lot of building space is going to be mothballed or sold. Which is, again, why I would say either merge or perish if you're a small church. These mergers are going to take between multiple small churches in towns and suburbs, first of all. There's going to be a more preoccupation with leading a merger through virtual worship, where we can actually be with each other without going to each other. And that's an easier, less threatening way to begin to build empathy and understand the culture of another church. So a lot of our administration in property and finance is going to be shifting. To me, we're already learning how to do that online. MissionInsight.com is now owned by American Church Services Technologies, ACST. And many of you may know ACST because of all of their internet software for administration, membership tracking, financial tracking, and so on. You all may be familiar with them. They have seen an enormous uptake in business because everybody's going online. So much of what we're doing administratively, in management, it's all going virtual. And very little of it is happening in office space and property. Well, those are a few changes and shifts. I think we have some time, Jeff, for some questions. And then
yes,
maybe
we do.
If I could have just a quick last word before we go, I would be appreciative.
Oh, absolutely. But first, questions, friends. You can post them in the chat if you like, and I'll read them out, or you can offer them up, unmute yourself. Sarah Merchant asked probably the simplest but biggest question: where do we start?
And I would say one word: empathy. I think you cannot start to change any program, and you cannot challenge any of your hidden attitudes as a person unless you engage or become empathic with people outside your normal social circle. And empathy, whether it's through immersion or conversation, however you think of it, whether it's through lifestyle segment research and using Mission Insight, whatever you do, but learning to have empathy for another human being and see them as a human being in all their complexity and uniqueness, rather than writing them off because of some ideological or dogmatic, or perhaps some color or language or disability or other issue, but to have radical empathy for the lifestyle segment that you never really talk to in your neighborhood. To me, that's always where you start. Know your community, empathize with your community. And then out of that, that's to me where you hear the call of Christ. That's where you hear God, because it's what I call a heartburst. The more you empathize with other people, the more you do that, then eventually you cry for them. And you weep for them and you laugh with them. And then I have what I call a heartburst for them. Your heart breaks for them. And you're saying to yourself from your heart, how can I bless you? How can I help you? And I'll sacrifice anything, and I'll do anything, and I'll change anything because I have a heartburst for you or for this group. And so empathy leading to heartburst and then to change.
So Stephanie Kidwell asks, how do we give courage to fail at new ways of being church, where it's scary to move from what we know?
What was the name again?
Stephanie Kidwell.
Stephanie, my immediate reaction is that I challenge all baby boomers out there to surrender their quest for quality. The church growth movement has been dominated by a quest for quality. We had to have the best choir, the best technology, the best seating, the best. In a quest for quality, you cannot tolerate failure and learn from your mistakes. If you're going to grow into the future of the church and experiment, you have to allow for what I call strategic mediocrity, combined with one-on-one mentoring. You have to allow people to be mediocre or to fail. And then you have to learn the technique of coming to them, not judgmentally or critically, but as a mentor, to help them learn not only to how to change tactics or learn new things, but you might say how to shape their leadership and shape their attitudes and so on. One of the greatest illustrations of this was at a church with a choir, and it had the best choir I've ever heard in my life. And after the worship service was over, I was walking down the hall, and I listened into the choir room, and I heard the choir director just ripping into and literally berating the choir for being imperfect. And their church had stalled and wasn't growing and was aging. They changed choir directors. Next time I go over, during the worship service, they now have a completely different band. And there's a young woman playing guitar, and they're playing a piece that clearly is beyond her ability. And she's trying and trying and trying. And finally, in the middle of the piece, she just gives up and her hands go to her side, her guitar falls, and she just starts crying. And the music director steps out in the middle of the worship service and says, wait a minute, stop the music. Let us pray. And the entire choir gathers around this poor young woman and kneel with her and pray with her and talk to her. I don't know what they said. And then they step away and he says, let's take it from the top. And then she starts it again and they play it again. It's not the best music in the world, but the young woman gets all the way through the song. And the entire congregation erupts in applause, standing ovation. And that congregation was filled with people under 30 years old. So that's what I'm getting at. You have to surrender this quest for quality in order to encourage experimentation. And you have to create a learning, trusting environment where you can mentor other people one-on-one rather than just rely on some continuing education program. And when you combine those things, then I think you can really engage in radical experimentation.
Good. One final question, and thanks, JR, for raising again. I missed it earlier, but JR Atkins asks, I wonder how we will measure success in the new normal. What metrics or no metrics? And after you answer that, I'll leave it to you, Tom, to wrap us up today.
Well, what are the old metrics? Churches have goals. Let's set that aside. The real metric of success pre-COVID-19 was this. At the end of the year, the pastor and the board asked themselves these questions. Is everybody happy? Do we have a balanced budget? Is everything maintained and repaired? Are the clergy getting paid? And is everybody in harmony? And those measurable outcomes are disappearing. So what is appearing? Well, you'll have measurable outcomes like are individual Christians going deeper and deeper and deeper into their walk with Christ? Is adult faith formation growing? Do we have a mission-driven debt? Manageable, yes. But are we willing to risk the parsonage and the pension plan to extend our impact in the community? Are we actually seeing transformations in our local community or in the sphere of our influence? And the last one I'll just mention, and there could be others, is does our congregation, our worshiping congregation, virtual or on-site, does our congregation mirror the lifestyle diversity of the community? Is the proportionate representation of lifestyle segments that are in our wider community and neighborhoods mirrored and all represented in the same proportions in our membership, our worship, and so on? those are some of the measurable outcomes, I think, that thriving church leaders in the future are going to be using to measure success. Now, some of those cannot be measured statistically very easily, but there are other ways to measure it, and the other two ways to measure it are by feedback and by storytelling. There are lots and lots of stories that you're hearing about, are we getting feedback from people that we have a reputation for? I mean, these are other ways than just counting numbers that we measure success. So I'll pause there, Jeff, and there may be other questions, and I would be glad to respond. My email is on my website, thrivingchurch.com, or you can ask Jeff to forward them. I'd be glad to talk with you and respond. I hope this has been helpful, but more importantly, I hope it has been hopeful, because the post-COVID-19 church, we're not quite sure what it is, but it's going to be very different. But it can be a very hopeful future. A lot will pass away, a lot may change, but there's a lot more that can emerge fresh and new in the Christian movement. And so my hope is that as you listen to this, but also when after this you're going to discuss it and have more panel discussions in small groups and explore in greater depth. But my hope is that always the outcome will be hope. Because after all, that's the number one thing that millennials and most generations are looking for today in culture. It's not about love, if I may say it that way. It's not about, oh, we all love each other and hug each other. It's all about hope. Do we have a reason to believe in tomorrow? And that's what I think the church of the future is really mainly going to be about. And my hope is that you have the courage to make the kinds of personal transformations as well as program changes that can make that hope happen. So thank you again for letting me join you. I hope this has been helpful, maybe a little bit disjointed at times. But I appreciate your attention and involvement and your questions. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Tom. And God bless.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom, for sharing this time with us. Thank you all for being here on the call today. This has been recorded. It will be available through conference channels. We will be sharing, we will be recording the chat so that we can forward any unanswered questions to Tom for consideration. And we will be providing the slides and the handout to you as well. Thank you all again very much for joining us. Vital Conversations will be continuing through the summer. We won't be doing them every week. We'll be doing them twice a month. But we look forward to having more insightful and provocative conversations together. So thank you again, Tom. Thank you to Isla for making this available to us, and we wish you all a very great day. Go in peace to love God and serve your neighbor in all that you do. God bless.
Thank you.